Sean, welcome to the Leaders Lab. I think I got you right when you drank something. Anyway, welcome
You
to the
did.
Leaders Lab. How are you?
Yeah, I'm doing great. I appreciate that. Yeah, I was sitting here thinking, man, I'm parched. Like I need to get some water. And it was like, wait a minute. What?
When we're ready, right? Well, thank you so much for coming on. I already, took care of your introduction, and what an introduction! I mean, you've had just your life story is incredible, and I know it all kind of started with something that happened when you were around 13 years old, right? Would you mind walking us through your story?
Oh, yeah, I wouldn't mind at all. It's interesting because I think we all have stories. You know,
Mm.
it's just different. And each person develops their own perspective. And mine actually came from battling cancer and through my teen years. So looking at me growing up, completely normal. Midwest guy from Ohio. A population where I grew up. The town was Willard, Ohio, and we had about 5,000 people growing up, and I think maybe there's 5,003 people. Not
Right,
much changes there. So,
right.
my backyard was a cornfield or a bean field. I was a farmer essentially, but I was into all sorts of things, cross country, track, swimming was a big one for me, and everything was completely normal until I suffered a knee injury from playing basketball. And then that ballooned every other joint up so much they stuck me in the hospital, thinking I was going to be fighting pneumonia, which hey, you're not going to cure cancer by sucking in a nebulizer. So I wasn't getting any
Right.
better. And they stuck me in a larger hospital where they did bone marrow tests, CAT scans, x rays, you name it. And as a 13-year-old, that's when they actually brought my parents in and they said, look, your firstborn son essentially now has an expiration date of 3 months to live.
Oh my God. What time frame was it from when you got into the hospital to when they gave you that diagnosis or
It was,
expiration?
yeah, it was probably going through the first hospital. I would say I was in there for a week, but at 13, I'm like, I'm gonna live this up for all it's worth because the cheerleaders were coming in giving me balloons. So I was like, this is awesome. I love the
Right.
attention, right?
Right.
So between the time that they thought I had pneumonia and the time that they diagnosed me with cancer, I would say that was within 2 weeks.
Okay. And in the hospital the whole time?
Pretty much, yeah. I mean, my teen years were spent in the hospital. My family was the set of doctors and nurses.
Wow. So what happened after that diagnosis?
Well, they started chemotherapy. I ballooned up 60, 70 pounds, lost all the hair in my body, lost my friends, lost everything. Because when you're like, think back to when you're 13 years old, 13, 14 years old, you're worried about potentially being popular in school. You're
Mm-hmm.
worried about the latest clothes, the nicest hairstyle, whatever it might be. I'm literally at this point 60, 70 pounds overweight, bald from head to toe. And I remember looking into the mirror and not even recognizing who I was. I used to be this tremendous athlete, and I think I still have records from swimming, and I couldn't even recognize the troll who was looking back at me. And my life was literally over at that point, but I wasn't focused on what my friends thought they should be focused on. I was more focused on surviving, day in, day out. That was it.
Wow. And so you're 13 when you get this diagnosis. What does it go into remission at some point, or like what happens? Because at some point, I mean, you said you spent the better part of your teenage years in the hospital. So the next like 6 years, 7 years, all kind of in and out of the hospital.
Pretty much. I mean, I went through the first cancer, and that was, let's say, about a year, a little over a year of chemotherapy where everything was just on pause. I was in the eighth grade, then I was going to the freshman in high school, and I was in remission for a year. And then going in for a checkup for the first cancer, they found this is crazy. They found a completely unrelated primary tumor, completely different one. So unrelated to the Hodgkin's, where it wasn't a side effect from the chemotherapy. It wasn't an extension of the Hodgkin's. It was a completely new type of cancer that affects 3 out of 1 million people with a prognosis of 6%. So if you have 100 people, keeping in mind that, 3 out of 1 million get it, if you have 100 people who get this cancer, 94 die. And
Wow.
it boggles my mind because I'm also the only person who's ever been diagnosed with Hodgkin's and Askins sarcoma. And I'm a number freak. So I put some numbers together and did some crunching. The chances of me surviving both Hodgkin's and the second one, which is called Askins sarcoma,
It's got to be in the billions, right? I mean, it's
it,
just
it's
crazy.
it's equivalent to winning the lottery 4 times in a row with the same numbers.
That's nuts. So you're literally like, so your cancer goes into remission. I'm guessing because, and I might be guessing wrong, but because you had your previous muscle memory of being an athlete and all that, I'm guessing you kind of get back in the groove, start feeling like a kid again, and maybe as soon as you start getting your legs out under you a little bit and feeling like life might be normal, then they hit you with this one, right? Is that kind of how it went?
Exactly. Because going through the first cancer, all I wanted to do was be normal.
Yeah.
And then I was normal for about a year. And then all of a sudden, boom, at this checkup, they said, okay, Sean, now you have another one. And I'm like, what? Well, what am I doing wrong? Like, what's going on here? And I was like, okay, well, I went through the first one. I didn't want to do it again.
Yeah. Did you? No, how were your parents handling all of this at the time? Because that's just crazy. And do you have? It sounded like you have siblings. Like, what's your family structure like?
So I have one younger brother. He's 3 years younger than I am. And at the time, it was mom and dad. And
Mm-hmm.
at the age I am now, is roughly the same age my dad was when I was going through it.
Mm-hmm.
So now I'm looking back at this and I'm thinking it was probably more difficult on my parents than it was on me because when you're 13 years old, you really don't have a grasp on what death really means.
Mm-hmm.
The second time I did it because I was 16, 17 years old, but my parents couldn't get into my brain. My parents couldn't take that cancer from me. They couldn't really help me battle against this disease.
Right.
So I also remember when I was going through the first one of the reasons why I continued to fight and continued to enjoy every day and make the most of everything I possibly could was I projected into the future and I pictured what my mom and dad would be feeling and what their lives would be like if they lost their firstborn son.
Wow. That's a pretty evolved way of thinking for a young kid, you know? I mean, that's a I'm a trainer for Tony Robbins and there's a famous thing that he does and that I've trained people on called the Dickens process. And it's exactly what you did. And normally it's not done over I have cancer and what does this look like because that's a little outside your control, but kind of it's sort of like let's say someone is not exercising, they're eating like, they're overweight and they're trying to get leverage on themselves to make this change, then what they do is they forecast into the future the way you do in Dickens, right? If you keep acting like this, everybody's going to be gone. You'll run out of money. You'll die, whatever it is. But it's amazing that you just kind of had the instinct to maybe use that as leverage on yourself. Do you feel like I mean, obviously there's something to do with your willpower and attitude and all that beat this. Yeah. I mean, you got to feel that.
Absolutely. And I really think it goes back to understanding that I didn't have a choice that I had cancer. It is what it is. But I could always choose how I wanted to react to it. So I could have this defeatist mentality. I could have this mindset of it's all over, or I could look at it from a different perspective. And at 13, I decided I didn't want to focus on not dying. I wanted to focus on living.
Mm-hmm.
And I've done that ever since. But I also think it was a combination of so many different things coming together for my survival, from modern medicine, family support, prayer, and inner will to move forward one step at a time. So I think it was like the perfect storm, but in a good way.
Of course. Yeah. So talk about that second time. How did that? How long were you in kind of the depths of? Because I'm guessing. I mean, if they're saying you only have a 6% chance of living, is that what the number was? 6%.
Well, that's going through just that second cancer,
Yeah.
6%, but with the two
Oh,
together,
right.
it's
Yeah.
0.0000001%.
Okay, but with the second one, when you go in and they diagnose that, is the first one gone at that point, or does it still exist when you get to the second one? Like, and they're just two independent things attacking your body at the same time still.
So the second, that's a great question. The second time around, I was in quote unquote complete remission from the first.
Okay.
But if there was any good in having the second cancer, some of the treatments I was receiving would also take care of if there was any residual from the first.
Could you imagine being the doctor selling chemotherapy and going, look, I got bad news and I got good news. You know,
Right.
bad news is you've got this terrible new cancer. Good news is
It's going
some
to
of the
help you the other
money,
way.
yeah, some of the money you guys spent on radiation, might pay off. That's nuts. So now you're about 16 when the second diagnosis comes in, and what is that? How long are you with that one now? Is that all through your teens?
That one was a little crazy because no one's ever had Hodgkin's and Askins before. The doctor they had no idea what to even do. And the treatments were actually so harsh. Every time I was in the hospital for a treatment, they knocked me out. I was in a medically induced coma for a year of my life. And I don't even remember being 16 years old. So
Wow.
I was getting chemotherapy for 3 months and then 1 month of radiation, which destroyed my right lung. I have one fully functioning lung. And then I went through 10 more months of chemotherapy. And at that point, like it's odd. I don't remember being 16, but I do a lot of hospital visits when I'm traveling or climbing or speaking or something. And I'll be there talking to, say, a 12 or 13-year-old laying in the hospital bed, talking to the parents, and I will smell something that triggers a memory. I'm like, oh my God,
Yeah, that's
that's where it gets
nuts.
a little creepy.
That is nuts. So, and how long does this go on for between the coma and the treatments afterwards? Is this throughout your adulthood? And then what happens with like your education? So I got to assume that like like when do you finish school? I mean, it seems like that was absent for years. Yeah.
Right. So there is so much to unravel here. The the first one was towards the end of my eighth grade year. So I actually, because I grew up in such a small town, the teachers would visit my house and drop off the homework and everything else. Wonderful people. The second time around, because I was physically and mentally incapable of going to school. And also, my parents and the doctors warned that going to school with a compromised immune system, I might not die of a cancer, I might die of a common cold.
Right.
So they wanted to be sure I was safe. And then towards the second semester, so January on, so the spring, I was feeling a little bit better. And my dad wanted me to audit some classes just to be back with my friends, to be as normal as possible. But I think at the time it was the OHAA, so the Ohio High School Athletic Association, deemed that you're only allowed X number of what is it? Eligibility.
Mm-hmm.
And if I would have gone to just even audit classes, I would be ineligible my senior year to run track, which I was a big track runner. I pole vaulted, I ran the 800 and everything. And my dad said that was completely unfair because my child's sick, going through cancer, and you're going to take away his senior year of eligibility. Like, how fair is that? Just going back, not going to get grades, but just auditing classes, being normal in school. So that was a fight that he actually won. He went to the board of directors for the
Oh, nice.
OHAA, won, I got it. And then a year after I was in treatment, I actually won my league's track meet in the 800-meter run.
Oh my God. What was your 800-meter time?
The 156, which isn't too bad for a guy with one lung.
Guys, to put that in perspective, that's about a half mile. So, you can do the math on that. That's crazy. What was your best mile time? Did you ever do a mile?
I did, and in all honesty, I think my best mile time was my first mile split in a cross country race where it was all downhill. I don't remember what it was, but I think that
Yeah.
was the fastest one.
I used to do the mile in high school, and I was good for my team, but not at like a sectional level. So I had a 4:38 was my best,
Oof.
but I wasn't fast enough in the 800. Like that required, that's almost like, to me that's like a long sprint, right? I mean that's a fast race. So okay, so you get out of high school, it sounds like, and it sounds like you're getting back on your feet. I mean you're becoming the athlete again. What's next?
Well, I go to college.
Okay.
I start off molecular biology, and I try to relive my high school years because they were taken from me.
Mm-hmm.
So at the time, I turned into Belushi from Animal House, man. I had a great time. But the problem is, which didn't take me too long to figure out, if you're a party animal and you're trying to pass immunology or organic chemistry and you don't open a book and study, it's probably not going to happen.
Right.
So I had a difficult time with that. Switched to psychology because I'm a huge believer in the mind body connection, and I
It's also way
utilize.
easier.
Yeah, and I found it so much more interesting.
Yes.
But I switched to that, and I wanted to become a psychologist for cancer patients.
Very cool. Is that where your career took you?
It is. Then I graduated college, and then I took the GRE, like so many people who still want to continue their education and kind of stay in school and not get into the real world. Then while I was working on my psycho-oncology degree, because as we know, cancer is not an individual disease, it affects the family. So I thought I had a lot to offer, but I couldn't help anybody until I helped myself because through college, it was just ignore the cancer, ignore
Mm-hmm.
everything I went through. But when I was confronted with it finally, when I finally slowed down, I was 1,000 or so miles away from my family, from everything. I saw it as a new lease. I'm going to start over. It was the first time I did that proverbial and literal look in the mirror, like, who are you?
Mm-hmm.
Like, what do you want from life? And I didn't realize that everything I had gone through changed who I was, but it was my choice on how I wanted to come out on the other side and use what I went through as a strength as opposed to holding me back.
That's amazing. And so you're having these thoughts in your early 20s. You decide you can leverage what you went through. You can help other people. You can do something fulfilling for yourself. But you had some inner work to do. What was that work for you? Like, what did you have to focus on, I guess, at that point?
It didn't even hit me until long long story short, I was bartending through my grad school, paying for it that way. And something happened where I realized that if I continued down this path, I'd be so far away from the Midwest moral and ethical guy that mom and dad raised. So I dropped out of school. I started doing some work on myself. And that was the moment that I realized, hey, I had been given a gift of this mind body connection. I know I can accomplish anything. Most people think they need to see it, then believe it. I believe it first, and then
Mm-hmm.
I can make it happen. And I utilized what I learned through my cancers to potentially give back. And that's where I came up with this crazy half cockamamie idea of climbing Everest with one lung and reaching around the world and using it as the largest platform in the world to scream hope, literally.
And so that the catalyst for all that happened right then, kind of in your epiphany of it, which was really like your second kind of Dickens moment, right? That we were talking about earlier, which was where it's like, I'm going down the wrong path. And if I keep repeating this behavior, I can see how this movie's playing out and I don't like it, right? And so you can do something to change it. And you decide to change it. Did it feel like, because I feel like sometimes in life, for people that I've met that are really influential and have done big things like yourself, I feel like when you have that moment, it clicks because it's like aligned, and it sounds like that it was that way for you. Like almost like a calling in a way. Did it sort of feel like that?
It did, and it was really odd because I was going to school in Jacksonville, Florida, of all places, when I decided to go climb the highest mountain in the world. The highest point in Florida is the top of the
Yeah,
Four Seasons
couple
Hotel in
hundred,
Miami.
couple hundred feet. Yeah,
Yeah. So I'm like, all right, well, that's not going to work. So I had to
right.
move myself to where I live now in Colorado, bring myself to where I could potentially train. But that calling literally was me looking back at my life and wanting to give back because I always want to help other people believe in themselves.
Hmm.
And we might get to it later, but I've been up Kilimanjaro now 24 times, the highest mountain in Africa, 24 times.
Wow.
And I do it every year as a fundraiser for a cancer charity. Anyone can go. It's an amazing, life-changing trip. But I love seeing the transition and the change in people. So when I wanted to go climb Mount Everest, I wanted to use that to help other people believe in themselves and believe in more, more in themselves, more in others, more, just more in general.
That's so cool. And so you're in your 20s, you decide to do this. Does it become does it kind of immediately become a career or a business, or is it something where you're doing other stuff too career wise and this is kind of on the side, or what does that look like?
Let me see if I can paint a good picture.
Yeah.
I first moved out to Colorado, and with my brother, he graduated college, so perfect timing. He's like, "I'm free, man. I'll join you with whatever you're gonna do. It's crazy ideas, let's do it." Um, we moved out to Estes Park, Colorado. We lived in a campsite in tents out of the back of my Honda Civic for 2 months, where I'm reaching out to corporations and I'm telling them, hey, I am going to be climbing Everest with one lung. I have zero climbing experience, and I'm going to be climbing Everest in 9 months. My office was a payphone bank and the library, right?
Sounds
So
a lot like being homeless.
I was homeless for a
Yeah.
couple months, man.
Yeah.
It was insane. But I knew I wanted to do it, and I knew that I wasn't going to be stopped. And I knew that it was just a goal to be on the mountain, to enjoy the trip, and enjoying the trip, and by and through enjoying the trip, the summit was going to be a byproduct of that.
That's amazing. And so your brother's along for the ride. Does he stay with you as this progresses?
He does. He does. The initial concept was to have him climb Everest with me
Yeah.
to show the importance of family support through adversity. But I'm sure, as you can imagine, climbing Everest is not exactly a cheap endeavor.
Right, right. And so you do the first Everest trip. What does that lead to? What happens? How do you get sponsors come on board or what?
So I eventually got a sponsor on board. They believed in me. They're like, all right, well, we heard it's physiologically impossible to climb Everest with one lung, but what you're doing has a deeper purpose behind it. And I was like, that's fantastic. So I got a big sponsor. I got Gore-Tex on board, and
Oh,
then after
nice.
that, the other companies came on board too. It's like the whole snowball analogy. I got one, and it just kind of snowballed after that. But the crazy thing is, I just remember this. I didn't have my summit suit to push up for the summit until like a week and a half before I was supposed to go. And the North Face came in, and I kid you not, they sent a box, right, with the summit jacket in the box. And all it said on the box was Sean Swarner, Everest Base Camp. And somehow it found me.
Oh my God. Like if that didn't, it just would have been, the mission would have been over. I mean, you can't climb that without it, right?
Yeah. I mean, I would definitely be coming back down, a few appendages less.
It seems like, you know, the more aligned we are, and in this case, the more aligned you are, then the more the universe sort of seems to conspire in your favor, right? I mean, how does a package find you in the middle of nowhere? Well, maybe it was supposed to find you because you were on point, right? You were doing what you're supposed to be doing. So amazing. How does one trip up turn into, how many times did you say you've climbed now? Or that was Kilimanjaro?
Yeah, Everest just once.
Okay.
That's enough. But I might be going back in 2025 to attempt it without supplemental oxygen, just to see if it's possible.
I'm imagining because of the severity and length of your health problems when you were a kid, I'm guessing you still have to consult with, maybe not today, but then I'm sure you were consulting all the time with doctors and stuff. I have to think that nobody in the medical profession thought this was a particularly great path to pursue, right?
I would say 99.9% of the world population thought it was impossible.
Right.
My doctors, for the most part, weren't agreeing with it, but they also knew what I was capable of because of coming back and doing the 800. I came back, was a swimming champion. I was undefeated for years, and he goes, you know what, go for it.
Right.
And the only thing I do want to say is I remember telling my mom and my dad the idea of climbing Everest. And as we were leaving Jacksonville, they lived in Hilton Head at the time. We drove up there and then across the country. I'll never forget his words. And he said, "We didn't get you through two cancers to go kill yourself on a hunk of rock and ice."
Probably good advice. You're like, I'm
Right.
going to remember that. I'm thinking of, remember the movie Forrest Gump where Lieutenant Dan says, now don't go get yourself killed. And he's like, I sure hope I don't let him down.
Yeah,
Like,
exactly.
such a good line. Um, awesome. So this, from that, I'm assuming some notoriety comes. I know eventually you become an author. Walk us through the kind of the next phase of this journey.
Well, it was interesting because when I reached the summit of Everest, I actually had a flag that had names of people touched by cancer. That was, and it was folded up in my chest pocket, always close to my heart. It reminded me why I was there. It
Hmm.
wasn't for me. It wasn't about the top. It was about the deeper purpose, the passion behind it, and the meaning, the true meaning. And after coming back from Everest, some time passed, and I think enough time passed where I forgot about how cold it was, how miserable it was sometimes,
Yeah.
how I couldn't breathe. And then I started remembering all the good stuff. As time passes, you start to forget about the negative things. And then I realized, oh, well, there are six other mountains, six other peaks. Let's take a flag to each one of those places and literally try to cover the globe in hope. And at that point, I was being approached by outdoor companies saying, "Hey, we want to be involved in this." I think
Mm.
initially they were afraid to come on board because they thought I would probably die.
Right. Right. I mean, that's what I'm thinking at the beginning. It's like, who wants to hook their corporate wagon? I mean, they're afraid of adversity and risk. And it's like, hey, maybe we'll do it if it's on tape delay, right? Like after you've completed it, maybe we'll do it. Um, yeah. So how do you get them on board? It was slow to come. How did just through persistence and achieve? I mean, at some point they'll fold because I mean, not to be crass to them for supporting you, but there's money in it, right? It looks good.
Exactly. So
Yeah.
I think a lot of them jumped on board for that.
Yeah.
And I didn't work with some companies because of that.
Mm-hmm.
I was approached by, I'm not going to say who it is, but I was
Sure.
approached by a company and they said, "Hey, here's X number of dollars." And like, well, I really can't use your stuff high up. And if I do, I'll probably die.
Mm-hmm.
And they said, "Well, why don't you take the money we're giving you? Why don't you buy what you're really going to use, but endorse our product?"
Oh, wow.
And I'm like, I can't do that. Morally and ethically, I can't. So I think I started getting in touch with the right people, the right companies. They started coming on board because I knew what I was looking for. I wasn't looking for a one-off a sponsorship. I wasn't looking, hey, I sponsor Kilimanjaro, hey, sponsor the South Pole, sponsor Antarctica, whatever. It was, hey, I'm looking for someone who believes in what I'm doing for a
Right.
higher purpose to make an impact, not just make some money. So I found some corporations who were willing to do that. It was a great relationship.
That's amazing. And who were some of those that supported you in your? I know we don't want to talk about the ones that didn't align, but some of the ones that did, I know you had some pretty big sponsors early on.
I would say the biggest one was probably Marmot,
Nice.
the outdoor company, and I worked with them on some product development as well.
Very cool. So now you decide, and as part of this, what you're talking about is you climb the highest peak in every continent, correct?
Correct. Yeah, it's called the Seven Summits.
Okay. And what time frame is this now? Like what age are you, I guess, at that time?
So I summited Everest 27, and then I think in the next 6 years I did the Seven Summits. Denali, which is the highest mountain in North America, up in Alaska. That one tripped me up a little bit. I fell 100 feet the first time. I was roped up to a climbing partner with 50 feet of rope between us. So I fell 50 feet to him and then 50 feet down. Then the next season, I went back up and we got more snow in 2 days than the Alaska range did the entire winter.
Oh, wow.
It's like 12 feet of snow. And I remember waking up in the middle of the night, unzipping my 40 below sleeping bag, flopping it open, and thinking, my God, I'm so hot because in temperatures like that, snow actually becomes an insulator.
Mm-hmm.
And I rolled over and my tent was right by my nose. And I poked it. I was like, well, that's not good.
Yeah.
We had to dig out and up to get out of our tent. It was insane. And then the avalanche danger was just off the charts. Flew home and then flew back up a week later, and in 11 days, perfect schedule, summited. And that was the final mountain of the 7 summits.
Wow. So you did all of that between like the age of 27 and 35, give or take, something like that?
Yeah, yeah, that's about right.
And when did you, you've authored how many books? Two?
2 books. Yeah.
And when did those come into play?
So the first one came into play about a year after climbing Everest, and then the second one was just recent, within the past year, because I'm looking at how I've done what I've done as opposed to just what.
Hmm.
And I've done a lot of keynote presentations. I still do a lot of corporate talks, and it never fails where somebody comes up and they continue the conversation as opposed to just saying, well, hey, that's a great story. They continue it by asking, but how did you do it?
Hmm.
Because my first goal was to literally crawl 8 feet from the hospital bed to the bathroom and then climb to the top of the world. And then looking at Kilimanjaro, the average success rate on the mountain is 48%, less than half. But
Hmm.
the groups I take up are at 99% success rate. So I'm trying to think, okay, well, there's something there. And that's where I started putting it into the book. And I put into it some programs and everything else. But now I'm looking back at how I've done what I've done as opposed to just what. And there are so many little intricacies built in there.
I feel like the big one though is the same thing that you had kind of in that chest pocket was the mission, something greater than yourself, right? And I think that like tied to that, I think that changes everything. I mean, I think that's kind of probably what got you out of the hospital when you were a kid. It's probably what got you up Everest the first time, right? It's like if you're only doing this because it was a physical feat or, something to brag about later, I mean, who knows, but I think the fact that you've impacted so many people is just huge. So what's life like now, the last few years, and what's next? Because like through all of this, like I get this idea of like, okay, first of all, you were always an athlete. It sounds like you're almost like born one, right? Like before the 13-year-old diagnosis, you were already, like you said, setting records and swimming and some other things. And so you resume that, and now with this, you know, even more fired up desire, I think, because of you've been held back in a way, and now you have this opportunity to excel again. But is it enough? Like, is there still more physical stuff to do, or like where are you with all of this now?
I love this, and we could talk on this probably for the next 9 hours.
Yeah.
But I think there came a point, and if you look at the 7 summits, highest mountain on every continent, did that. And then I skied to the South Pole, I skied to the North Pole. That's called the Explorers Grand Slam. And I think maybe 70 people in history have done that. You add on the World Championship Hawaii Ironman Triathlon, and I'm the only person in history to ever do all that.
Mm-hmm.
When I reached the North Pole, it was a culmination of the 7 summits and the 2 poles in this giant Explorers Grand Slam, which I still think sounds like a Denny's breakfast platter. Rename it somehow.
It's the Grand Slam part. I think they do have
Right.
something called a Grand Slam.
So when I reached it, in all honesty, I was elated, but then not long after that, I was depressed because it hit me. Going back to your question, I was like, well, now what?
Mm-hmm.
What next? Looking at the mountains, starting with Everest, I got to base camp April 8th. I summited May 16th. I was on the mountain for almost a month and a half. I was on the summit for what, 30 minutes?
Right.
So the same thing with all these mountains. You spend so much time, and in life too, you spend so much time working towards these goals, these peaks that you're trying to reach, but you spend very little time actually there.
Mm-hmm.
You learn so much more going through that journey than you do reaching the end.
Right.
Every mountain peak that I've reached, there's going to be another mountain to climb. Every finish line, there's always going to be another race. So now I'm to the point where I'm like, okay, why don't I learn to appreciate the process?
Mm-hmm.
In which most people do. Yes, you have a focus on the goal, that's what you want, but you need to focus on how you're doing it. So like you said, having that deeper passion, that deeper purpose. It's never about the top of the mountain. It's never about the new car. It's never about the new height, the new house. It's never about the new salary. It always goes back to your personal core values. Why are you doing it?
Yep.
So for me, what am I looking for next? Well, now I'm looking to help other people. I've been up Kilimanjaro 24 times. I know I can make it.
Hmm.
I want to help others get there, because when you get to the top of the mountain and you're sitting there by yourself watching the sunrise, yeah, it's beautiful, but yay, who are you going to share it with?
Right. Right. And there's a TED talk by a guy named Sean Aker that, and I forget the title of it, but I think it's called like the happy work equation or something like that. But what he talks about is exactly what we're talking about, where, and he does it in a really funny and kind of concise way. It's about a 13-minute TED talk. But what he talks about is that we have it all kind of wrong in society, and that, we put happiness on the other side of hitting goals. But we also are so goal driven that as soon as we set a goal, we set another goal. So we never live, to your point. We don't sit there and look at the view all that long. And it doesn't have to be climbing, the highest peaks in the world. It could be meeting your sales quota for the quarter or whatever. And if we don't learn, like you're saying, how to enjoy the journey, then we'll never really be happy. We're just on the perpetual hamster wheel, and it all looks good because you make decent money or whatever, but it's not fulfilling ultimately.
Absolutely. I mean,
Yeah.
happiness is an internal job.
Yep.
The car is not going to bring me happiness. I was at a mastermind a couple weeks ago, and there was a guy right up on stage right before me, and a multi-billionaire, like three or four different private jets and everything. And he sits down in the audience, and I start doing this interview, and I start answering questions, and all of a sudden I stop and I look at the guy, and I point to him like, "Why are you here?" Because in my mind, on the outside, he has everything, right?
Right.
I'm like, "Why are you here?" And he goes, "Well, because I want to network." I'm like, "Well, why?" He's like, "Well,
Right.
because I want to make more money." I was like, "Well, why?" He's like, "Well, because by networking and making more money, I can have more companies." I'm like, "But why?"
Right.
What's the point? You have four private jets, you have $1 billion in the bank. What are you really here for? And we keep narrowing it down to, I just keep hammering away, peeling back those layers. And as soon as he got rid of that ego, he's like, "Well, I'm here because looking back at home, I want to take care of my family." I'm like, boom, there you go.
Mm-hmm.
You're not here to network. You're not here to make more money. You're here because of your family.
Mm-hmm.
So once we can figure out why we're doing things, and it goes back to our personal core values, understanding those are the driving forces, and they can be different for everybody in the world, no judgment, completely non-judgmental. But once you hone into a love, appreciation, freedom, security, whatever it might be, now you've ultimately tapped into uh, a well that's never going to run dry. You're going to
Yes.
constantly be motivated to get something done because you're going after other things that don't mean that much to you, but you're doing it for a deeper purpose.
Isn't it really interesting though, even with this guy that's a multi-billionaire, he's still having feelings maybe of scarcity, or like what he's providing isn't enough, right? And it always comes
Absolutely.
down to that. And it doesn't matter if you're worth 3 billion or $300. I know a guy in my kind of adopted hometown of Phoenix that, um, and when I wasn't in such a great evolved, not that I should call myself evolved, but I guess in my less self-aware time, I should say, this guy is about the same age as me, and I learned how to teach yoga with my wife, and it was something we were kind of doing on the side. And this guy did it full time, and we are like the same age. And to me, it's like, well, he doesn't even have a real job, and he only has an apartment. And I'm just being really judgmental about the whole thing. But he was also like the happiest, one of the most content, well-rounded. I was always fucking stressed and like showing up pissed off to yoga class. You know what I mean? Having to shake off the day just to get in teacher mode. And you know, who are we to judge kind of where someone else is coming from? Because this guy had figured out the secret sauce that maybe that billionaire, had or hadn't figured out, right? But whatever it is, it doesn't matter. So I think it's all about living and learning how to live in the present and appreciate what's in front of us, right? And that's an ever-going lesson, that I'm trying to learn.
It's interesting you mentioned that, because going through what I went through during the developmental years of my life, right? So while other people were worried about being popular at school, I
Yeah.
was fighting for my life, going to bed night after night, being terrified to close my eyes, not knowing if I was going to wake up the next morning. So looking at, I've been to 70 some different countries. I've been immersed into different cultures around the world because of the climbing and speaking and everything. And going back to Africa, 24 trips up the highest mountain in Africa. And they're some of the happiest people I've ever met. They sleep on dirt floors.
Yeah.
But I think they're happy, and why so many Americans and so many other people are unhappy is because they have this giant ego where they try to control situations the way they think it should be done,
Yeah.
as opposed to understanding that we oftentimes don't have control of other situations, but we have control in how we react to it.
Right.
Be happy and thankful for what we have. Yes, have tremendous goals that pushes you forward, but be grateful for what we have and be happy with that.
Absolutely. There was, I'm going to give you one other story that you might find kind of funny. So, my wife and I got married really young and didn't take a honeymoon because we didn't have any money when we first got married. I was in the military and we waited a few years. And then finally we went over to Jamaica and there was this kid. I like figuring out how things work in different cultures, right? So, in all these kind of like makeshift, wood panel little stores that they have that you see in countries like that, and one braids hair and the next one they make handcrafted masks or whatever, and I was like kind of watching the way that all these things work together, and there's like one young man that like, and when I say young man, at that time I was 30 and he was 25, so but looking back on it, um, it was clear that like everybody reported to him, and I was kind of fascinated by the way that it worked, because you wouldn't notice it if you weren't paying attention, but he ran everything. He got a cut of everything. I could just tell that it was his thing. And I became friends with him and started talking to him that week and learning more about how things worked, and I'd buy him beers and stuff. And towards the end, I told my wife, like the day before we were leaving, I'm like, we called him Go-Go because he was like a hustler, right? And I go, I'm gonna invite Go-Go back to the States. I'm going to give him a job in our business. He can live at our house until he makes enough money to buy his own thing. And in my mind, I'm thinking, I'm going to save this guy. You know what I mean? Like I'm going to provide him a life, that he wouldn't have if he stayed here. And I remember I go to him and I go, Go, great news, man. I'm so impressed with you. You're such a good guy. And I want you to come to the States. And I got this job for you. You can live at my house. And he doesn't like accept on the spot or anything, which was kind of shocking to my ego. And he goes, very good offer, man. I have to think about it. I'm like, Jesus, what's he thinking about? So the next day we're leaving. I go in to see him and he's like, yeah, I got to turn you down. And I said, why? And he said, I like my life here. And I said, really? But you guys don't even have like electricity in the shack. He's like, we have what we need. And I go, what about when it rains? Like you guys don't even have proper wall. Or what about in the winter? You don't have proper walls. I said, it's Jamaica, man. Like the winter. And I'm like, and he sort of bats down like every rejection I have, because our way of just hustling and making money and grinding it out and working our asses off was not appealing. I mean, I'm certainly having some material things was kind of appealing, but that whole change or trade-in of what he has now versus what we have was not an equal trade to him. And it really opened my eyes because I sort of got it in that moment,
I love that story, and it's so similar in Africa, in Tanzania. And I've realized that maybe this is going along what you were talking about too, is happiness is not a destination. It's
Okay.
not a place where we arrive and be happy.
Right.
It's this whole journey, and life is way too short to not be happy and compare ourselves to other cultures. Like you were trying to help him out,
Right.
genuinely trying to help him out, but he didn't need it. He didn't
Right.
want it. He was
Right.
completely happy with what he had.
Right. And I think maybe he looks at our example of happiness and goes, I don't see a lot of it.
Yeah,
Right.
exactly.
Yeah. I mean, really, you're just going to work me 12 hours a day and yeah, he gets up at 10 o'clock. He rolls into the shacks. He can drink a beer while he's working. He doesn't really need my help. Life's going good for him right now.
Absolutely. Fresh seafood every day, right?
Yeah, super cool. So I know you do a lot of corporate gigs and stuff like that. Is that your primary thing now? And is there anything else that you want to close out with before we get going? It's been amazing getting to know you, by the way. Your story is inspiring and educational and all kinds of things all at the same time. So thank you so much for coming on.
I appreciate it, and I appreciate the platform that you're giving so many people to share their stories. And
Thank you.
I think we all have a story to share. We can all learn from each other. We have two ears and one mouth for a reason, right?
Yep.
So definitely doing a lot of corporate keynote talks. I've worked with some really large corporations, and I just recently put together the Big Hill Challenge, which helps people utilize their personal core values to get that deeper passion and meaning, and basically go from here to here without having to go down into the valley and climb back up. It's interesting looking back and learning and seeing what I have by appreciating what I've been through
Yeah.
as opposed to fighting against it.
I feel like you've always done that. It seems like, I mean, I know I wasn't there, and I'm sure in the moments at times, not that you didn't go through like, why is this happening to me? And I'm sure those feelings came, but I feel like you ultimately have always leveraged this as a win, and it's just amazing to see. So thanks again so much for joining us, and come back anytime.
I appreciate it. And going through life, why wouldn't people want to be happy?
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. Thanks so much for everything that you're doing.
I appreciate it, Ken. Thank you.
All right, take care.